Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 778, and today is April 2nd, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I got a fairly sizable stack of news to get through on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into the content. Just want to quickly remind people to share this show. Follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_, and subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. I will be doing a new episode of that this afternoon with Daniel McAdams, the director of the Ron Paul Institute, joining me. So I'm very excited about that, and I think you guys will enjoy it. Let's get into the articles today. The first one here, White House spent $40 million in first month housing prisoners at Gitmo. I wrote this one for the Institute on April 1st, and no, that's not some kind of April Fool's joke. President Trump is spending $40 million per month to house about 300 migrants in the U.S.-occupied Cuba. Some of the detainees are being held at the infamous George W. Bush-era torture prison. According to the New York Times, the Department of Defense spent $39.3 million in the project's first month, housing around 300 migrants at its facilities at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Additionally, the Department of Defense and Homeland Security report about 1,000 employees are needed to house the immigrants sent from the U.S. to Cuba. 5 senators toured the facility last week, with Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat from Rhode Island, arguing that sending migrants to Gitmo was a waste of resources. He wasn't necessarily saying that they shouldn't be detained, just that the U.S. troops and money spent at Gitmo could be spent doing other things. So, while some of the men are being held at an immigration facility in U.S.-occupied Cuba, over 100 are detained at the military base, which includes the torture prison used to hold accused terrorists. Most of the migrants held at the U.S. facilities in Cuba are Venezuelan. Trump has indicated that detentions could be indefinite. He said when announcing the policy, this will double our capacity immediately, right? And tough. That's tough. That's a tough place to get out of. In implementing his immigration policy, Trump has taken a number of steps that are potentially illegal. During the Bush administration, Americans were regularly told not to worry about the unconstitutional torture taking place at Gitmo, as the detainees were said to be the worst of the worst. However, the claim was debunked, as an overwhelming number of the detainees at Gitmo were later found to be innocent of the crimes accused of. Department of Homeland Security Chief Kristi Noem has used the same rhetoric when explaining current U.S. policy. There may be some resources that could be established for the worst of the worst at Guantanamo Bay, and that's something Trump is evaluating along with our team at the Department of Homeland Security. While members of the Trump administration have portrayed those sent to Gitmo as violent criminals, reviews of many detainees had turned up only minor offenses, such as illegally entering the U.S. Additionally, Trump has targeted permanent U.S. residents and visa holders having their standing in the U.S. revoked for expressing support for Palestine. Those detained under the draconian policy have been arrested by ununiformed federal agents wearing masks. And so, this is, I think, very concerning violations of the Constitution and our rights, what's going on with Trump's immigration policy. I'm not necessarily opposed to having an immigration policy or deporting people who are in the country illegally, but sending them to Guantanamo Bay and, of course, taking people who are in the U.S. illegally and depriving them of their First Amendment rights and deporting them is also extremely troubling and meant to chill dissent in the U.S. against the U.S. support for Israel. Next up here, Russia says it cannot accept U.S. proposals on Ukraine in current form. So this is the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Tuesday that Russia couldn't accept U.S. proposals on ending the war in Ukraine in their current form since they do not address the root causes of the conflict. Rabkov said Moscow hasn't seen a clear signal from Ukraine that it's time to end the war. He explained, "We have today is an effort to find a framework that would make it possible to ensure America's vision for a ceasefire. The idea is to move on to some other model and frameworks which, as far as we can see, have no room for Russia's core demand, that is, the need to resolve the issues stemming from the root cause of this conflict." He said that Russia has the U.S. proposal and takes it very seriously, but that it couldn't be accepted as they are. Recent negotiations between the U.S. and Russia have focused on establishing a moratorium on the targeting of energy infrastructure in the war and a Black Sea ceasefire. While progress has been made on those fronts, there's no sign the negotiations will lead to a full ceasefire and a lasting peace deal anytime soon. President Trump has also recently threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russian oil and said he was pissed off at Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Tuesday that the U.S. and Russian officials will soon meet in Istanbul for future talks. He said that the talks are focused on ending the war in Ukraine, restoring the Black Sea deal that allowed shipments to go through, and normalizing U.S.-Russian ties by removing irritants from the relationship. All right, moving on to the situation in the Middle East, starting off with Gaza. U.S. blames Hamas for Israeli execution of Palestinian medics, and this is just absurdly stupid. There's that meme, I think it's from the Eric Andre show, where, he shoots somebody and says, why the other person do it? This is Israel killing, executing medics, and then saying, why did Hamas do that? So the State Department on Monday blamed Hamas when asked about the Israeli execution of 15 Palestinian medics and rescue workers who were recovered from a mass grave in southern Gaza city of Rafah. The 15 workers included 8 members of the Palestinian Red Crescent, 5 civil defense workers, and 1 UN staffer. The head of the UN's Humanitarian Affairs Office in Palestine said the evidence indicates that the first responders were shot and killed by Israeli forces one by one and buried along with their ambulances and other vehicles. We're digging them out in their uniforms with their gloves on. They were here to save lives. Instead, they ended up in a mass grave. These ambulances have been buried in the sand. There's a UN vehicle there buried in the sand. A bulldozer from Israeli forces has buried them. And so imagine, right? They lined them up, went down the line, boom, 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 killed them all. Just the most atrocious form of mass execution. And these are medics, right? Like, this wouldn't have been acceptable to do if these were members of Hamas. They would have been prisoners of war. They could have been detained. They could have been captured. They could have been killed in the fighting. But to execute them when they were unarmed would have still been a war crime. But these weren't members of Hamas. These were medics. These were people that were going to the area to dig children out from under the rubble. They were there to save people, to help people, to restore any kind of order and dignity to the people of Palestine. And that's what Israel wants to deprive. This is a genocide. This is meant to drive every last Palestinian out of Gaza or have them killed. And look, if there's people there to dig your children out of the rubble, you're going to be more likely to stay. If all the medics are dead, if all the civil workers are dead, more and more Palestinians will likely choose to leave Gaza because the situations there are just absolutely unlivable. And look, if these people could be, bound and executed on the side of the road, and they were for the Palestinian Red Crescent, they were for the United Nations, they're civil defense workers, then anybody could be killed. This is meant to terrify. This is meant to shake Palestinian society. This is meant to say that none of you, not a single one of you, are safe if you stay in Gaza. We will kill every last one of you. This is the most sick and deprived thing that can be done. And Israel is not only doing it just this one time. This isn't a one-off. This is happening day after day after day. And it's not always medics. Sometimes it's hospitals, sometimes it's schools, sometimes it's the execution of children. But it's happening day after day after day. Unacceptable war crimes being committed by Israel using U.S. weapons. And Washington, under now 2 administrations, has nothing to say about it. So when asked about the comments from the UN, the State Department spokeswoman Tammy Bruce immediately blamed Hamas. I can tell you that for too long, Hamas has abused civilian infrastructure, critically using it to shield themselves. Hamas's actions have caused humanitarians to be caught in the crossfire. When pressed on whether the U.S. would assess the situation since there was a chance Israeli forces used American weapons, Bruce said, "Every single thing that is happening in Gaza is happening because of Hamas, every single dynamic." And so there's no evidence that there was some battle, that Hamas was sneaking up behind the medics to ambush the brave Israeli soldiers just there to defend themselves. There's no evidence that that's what's happened. These medics were executed. Israel has said that they believe the medics were Hamas, but they weren't caught in the crossfire. This wasn't because of Hamas. This is because Israeli soldiers took 15 unarmed people, medics, UN staffers, and chose to execute them. That's what happened. There is no piece of this that can be blamed on Hamas. But this is not only the Trump administration line, this was for over a year the line we got from the Biden administration too. Our government has completely sold itself out to Israel. Our morality, our ethics are absolutely gone. Any reputation, any standing we have in the world, absolutely gone, and all for the benefit of Israel. So according to the Palestinian Red Crescent, each body was removed with around 20 gunshots. Israeli occupation forces brutally, savagely executed the civil defense team, the spokesman Mohammed Basel said. The Israeli military has acknowledged it opened fire on the ambulances in Rafah, but claimed it was a mistake. And so again, there's no Hamas there. There's no case that this could be blamed on Hamas, and yes, the U.S. is running cover for Israel on this. It's so disgusting and pisses me off so much. All right, next up here, Israel kills over 1,000 Palestinians in Gaza since breaking ceasefire. So the Gaza Health Ministry said Monday that Israeli strikes have killed 101 Palestinians since Israel restarted its war on the Strip with a massive bombing attack on March 18th. The Health Ministry said another 2,359 Palestinians have been injured by Israeli attacks in that time. The ministry's figures are based on the number of dead and wounded Palestinians brought to the hospital, so it is certainly an undercount. The renewed Israeli bombing campaign has been devastating for children. The first day of the attack was described by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz as the largest child massacre in history. Again, this is an Israeli newspaper. This isn't, some crazy anti-Semite. This isn't, the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. This is a mainstream Israeli newspaper saying that the Israeli military conducted the largest massacre of children in its history. Unbelievable. The exact breakdown of the 101 dead is unclear, but when the death toll was at 830, the health ministry said it included 322 children, accounting for nearly 40% of the Palestinians killed by Israel up to that point. Heavy Israeli airstrikes on Gaza continued on Sunday and Monday as Palestinians attempted to celebrate Eid al-Fitr, a Muslim holiday that marks the end of Ramadan. The health ministry said on Monday the Palestinians were killed and 80 Palestinians were killed and 305 were injured over the previous 48-hour period. The health ministry also said it recorded death tolls since October 2023 has reached 50,357, and the number of wounded has risen to 14,400. According to the Palestinians missing and presumed dead under the rubble, the death toll is about 62,000. Estimates that factor in indirect cause of deaths from the U.S.-backed Israeli siege put the death toll in the hundreds of thousands. The Trump administration has fully supported Israel's resumption of the slaughter in Gaza. Since coming into office, Trump has signed off on over $12 billion in new military aid and arms deals for Israel and has emboldened Prime Minister Netanyahu by repeatedly calling for the Palestinians in Gaza to be permanently expelled. All right. Bad news on the food front in Gaza. Gaza bakeries close as flour supplies run out due to Israeli blockade. So all bakeries in Gaza have been forced to close as flours and other food supplies are running out due to the Israeli blockade on all goods entering Gaza. According to the Associated Press, the UN's World Food Program circulated a memo to aid groups on Monday saying it could no longer operate the 19 bakeries it it was operating due to a lack of supplies, since other bakeries run by the World Food Program had previously shut down. Abdel Nasser al-Jrami, the head of Gaza's Bakery Owners Association, announced on Tuesday that all bakeries would be shutting down. He said bakeries will no longer operate until the Israeli occupation opens the crossing and allows necessary supplies to enter. So a journalist based in northern Gaza told Middle East Eye that after bakeries closed, displaced Palestinians went to markets looking for flour only to find a single bag cost $115, up from the pre-war cost of quite a bit. It wasn't very much. So when the short-lived ceasefire was in effect, bags of flours could be found for 35 shekels. So $115 is 400 shekels, by the way. And so the pre-war price of a bag of flour looks like it was about $10 or so. The journalist said, people are now in a state of confusion. They have forgotten the war, displacement, migration, and bombing. Their main thoughts have become flour. Heavy Israeli airstrikes continued in Gaza on Thursday as Palestinians were looking for flour. Since Israel has restarted its genocidal war on the Gaza Strip, more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed. The U.S. has strongly backed Israel's bombing campaign and its blockade on all goods entering Gaza, which amounts to collective punishment for the civilian population of the Strip, a war crime under international law. The Israeli military has now ordered the full evacuation of the southern city of Gaza. This one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, March 31st. The Israeli military on Monday ordered the forced evacuation of the southern Gaza city of Rafah and other nearby areas as it's ramping up attacks on the Palestinian territory. So the IDF's Arabic language spokesman ordered the residents of Rafah and surrounding areas to flee to al-Mawasi, a tent camp on the coast that has been designated as a so-called humanitarian safe zone, but has been frequently targeted by Israeli airstrikes. The Israeli officials said the military is returning to fight with great force to eliminate the capabilities of the terrorist organization in these areas. Shortly after the evacuation order, the IDF began attacking Rafah, killing at least 2 people. Israel launched a major assault on Rafah in May of 2024, which President Biden insisted at the time would be a limited attack, but the attack left the city in ruins. Since then, Israel has controlled the Rafah border crossing and the Philadelphia corridor on the Egypt-Gaza border. The Israeli military was supposed to withdraw from the corridor at the end of the first phase of the ceasefire, but never did. One of Israel's many violations of the truce deal. The renewed assault on the city has been seen as an effort by Israel to expand its buffer zone, which refers to the land inside Gaza occupied by the IDF. We've also recently had the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, say that the IDF is going to begin annexing Gaza, and a report from, I believe it was the Washington Post, detailing how the Israelis are planning an even more brutal military occupation and invasion of Gaza. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Institute on April 1st. Palestinian teen is 63rd to die in Israeli prison since October 7th. A 17-year-old from the West Bank died in an Israeli prison, becoming the 63rd Palestinian and first minor to die in detention since October 7, 2023. The youth was held for 6 months without charges prior to his death. So Waldi Ahmed's family reports that he was a healthy high schooler when he was arrested by Israeli forces in September. He was accused of throwing stones, but was held in detention without charges. His death is unclear, and Israel has a policy of withholding the bodies of Palestinians who die in Israeli prisons from their relatives. Ahmed's family believes he collapsed and hit his head near the end of March due to dysentery from the deprivation he was subjected to by his Israeli captors. Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has bragged that he has made living conditions worse for Palestinians detained in facilities under his control. Many are held under administrative detention and deprived of due process that the Bill of Rights provides to Americans. He has also suggested executing prisoners to make room for new detainees. Ahmed was held in the Mandingo prison, which has become notorious for abuse and torture. Arrest reports detainees and prisoners at the facility in northern Israel have reported several cases of harsh violence and abuse carried out by prison wardens. The torture includes guards kicking, punching, hitting their testicles, and humiliating prisoners. Some testified a prisoner who had been beaten died of his injuries. So in February, Khalid Muhammad Qassam Abdallah, a 41-year-old detainee from the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, died at the same facility. He too was reportedly held without charges before his death, and family members said he was also in good health prior to his capture. Released Palestinians and international rights organizations have reported widespread Israeli abuse of detainees by prison guards, including sexual assault, torture, beatings, and medical neglect. So, also, still agitating towards war with Iran, U.S. imposes more sanctions on Iran as tensions soar. This one from Dave DeCamp, April 1st at antiwar.com. The U.S. on Tuesday announced new sanctions on the alleged Iranian weapons procurement network as President Trump is ramping up the so-called maximum pressure campaign against Iran. The Treasury Department said it sanctioned 6 entities and 2 people based in Iran, the UAE, and China over allegations they were involved in the procurement of unmanned aerial vehicles, components on behalf of the Iranian Quds aviation industry, a leading manufacturer for Iran's UAV program. Since President Trump signed a new executive order reinstating his so-called maximum pressure campaign on Iran, his administration has been increasing sanctions and threatening to take military actions against Tehran. The new sanctions come after the president threatened to bomb Iran if a deal isn't reached on the country's nuclear program. The Iranian supreme leader hit back at Trump, warning of a strong counterattack in response to any U.S. attack. A high-level IRGC commander also warned that 10 U.S. military bases in the region were in range of Iranian missiles. Trump's threat to bomb Iran came after intelligence agencies said in the annual threat assessment that Tehran is not building a nuclear weapon and that there was no sign the Ayatollah has reversed his 2003 fatwa that banned the production of weapons of mass destruction. That threat assessment did note that conversations around nuclear weapons inside Iran has changed in the face of Israeli aggression in the region. Ali Larijani, an advisor to the Ayatollah, warned on Monday that the U.S. or Israel bombed Iran, the Islamic Republic could be forced to pursue nuclear weapons. And this is one of the reasons I ultimately don't think that Israel and the U.S. are going to go to war with Iran, is that the consequence will push them to make nuclear weapons. However, I do think Trump is going to continue to issue threats in the coming weeks. So next one here. Pentagon, I guess it was ordered by Trump, deploying additional aircraft carrier and air assets to the Middle East. So the Pentagon announced on Tuesday that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has ordered the deployment of an additional aircraft carrier and more U.S. air assets to the Middle East, a move that comes amid a U.S. bombing campaign in Yemen and increasing threats against Iran. So the Pentagon spokesman Sean Parcel said that the USS Harry Truman and his strike group will remain in the Middle East and will be joined by the USS Carl Vinson and its accompanying warships, which are traveling to the region from the Asia Pacific. Parnell said Hegseth also ordered the deployment of additional squadrons and other air assets that will further reinforce our defensive air support capabilities. Last week, the U.S. sent at least 5 B-2 bombers to its base in Diego Garcia out in the Indian Ocean, which could be used as a launch pad to bomb either Yemen or Iran. The Biden administration used B-2s to launch heavy airstrikes on Yemen in October of 2024, an attack the Pentagon made clear was a message to Iran. The U.S. has been bombing Yemen every day since launching its initial round of airstrikes on March 15th. President Trump has signaled that the airstrikes could intensify, warning the Houthis that they don't stop their attacks, real pain will come. And we will get into some updates on Yemen in a minute. Just one story here on Lebanon quickly. Overnight Israeli strikes in Beirut. Building kills 4 and wounds several others. So Jason Ditz at antiwar.com writes, for the second time in less than a week, Israel has carried out airstrikes in a residential area in the suburb of the Lebanese capital city. This attack was carried out at 3:30 a.m., which came with no warning. At least 4 people were killed and a number of others wounded. Israel said the attack targeted Hezbollah member Hassan Badar, and some reports suggest he was among the slain. The Israeli statement accused him of being secretly in league with Hamas and claimed he posed an imminent threat against Israel. Israel carried out attacks on a private school in southern suburb of Beirut just Friday, which was the first Israeli strike launched against Metro Beirut since the ceasefire in November. They claimed the school was full of attack drones, though no such evidence was provided. These attacks are an extreme violation of the ceasefire, needless to say. Israel has conducted hundreds of strikes on Lebanese territory since the ceasefire, but these attacks on the capital speak to the substantial escalation of their aggression. France, one of the 2 guarantors of the ceasefire, the other being the U.S., was critical of the attacks, calling them unacceptable violations. The U.S. is taking a much different route, with the State Department endorsing the attacks and declaring Israel to be defending itself. And once again, no matter what Israel does, the Trump administration now just endorses all of it, no matter how many ceasefire violations. All right, so another one from Jason Diaz here. Growing network of Israeli outposts in Syria and Lebanon suggests the IDF is planning a long stay. Much was made about the 5 hilltop posts and Israel hastily assembles before the deadline to withdraw from Lebanon. Outposts they'll ultimately retain to this day, which seems more or less permanent. Israel isn't done expanding their military presence beyond their own borders. The temporary outposts are being thrown up around the frontier between Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and the currently also Israeli-occupied portions of southern Israel. Israel invaded Syria in December after regime change and presented it as a semi-short-term measure for national security, but it does look like just a flat-out annexation at this point. So next up here, White House claims Yemen airstrikes incredibly successful despite failure to stop Houthi attacks. So the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt said Tuesday that the U.S. bombing campaign in Yemen has been incredibly successful, even though the Houthis have shown no sign of backing down. These Houthi strikes have been incredibly successful. Last time I was at this podium, there were more than 100 successful strikes. There have now been over 200 successful strikes. Iran is incredibly weakened as a result of these attacks. This is just propaganda. The U.S. has bombed Yemen 100, 200, 300 times. Just dropping bombs on countries don't lead to success. On the last episode of the Anzalone show, I played a clip from retired General Frank McKenzie, who said that we need to wrap up what we're doing in Yemen so we can move on to other things. And this seems to be the same thinking of Leavitt, right? We bomb all these targets, we weaken Iran, we remove the Houthis, and then we can move on to the next thing. It doesn't work that way. You can't just simply bomb the Houthis out of power. One, if you do that, you're very likely to create a situation just like we did in Syria, where we end up with Al-Qaeda in charge of the country rather than a Shia group that's enemies with Al-Qaeda. And then number 2, of course, is that the Houthis may not be able to be dislodged through just an air campaign, as the Saudis found after 5 years of trying. And not only that, they are starting to down some more U.S. Reaper drones. I think 16 in total over the past year and a half the Houthis have shot down, which I think may, entering into the 9-figure number of some pretty major costs for the U.S. government there. All right, so wrapping up today's show, bipartisan pair of senators questioned Trump's bombing campaign. So, a pair of U.S. senators questioned Trump's bombing campaign in Yemen, which was launched without congressional authorization. Senators Rand Paul and Jeff Malarkey pointed out in a letter to the president on Tuesday that neither President Biden's bombing campaign against the Houthis nor the U.S.-backed Saudi war against the Yemeni group did anything to deter the Yemeni group, and noted that their attacks did stop during the short-lived Gaza ceasefire. And so I think this is really important. I don't expect it to go anywhere. Congress just doesn't have enough of a backbone to stand up to the president and assert their constitutional authority over war powers, but that really needs to be something that the American people are talking about. And this letter from Paul and Malarkey put us on the right path there. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. Again, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show so you catch our episode with Daniel McAdams later today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Back with another episode on Friday.